The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the clouds as Captain James Wilson pulled into the staff parking lot of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. His black Mercedes, though 10 years old, gleamed under the early light, a reflection of how meticulously he maintained everything in his life. At 45, James had earned every stripe on his pilot's uniform through hard work and dedication. Standing 6 feet tall with salt and pepper hair that added to his distinguished appearance, he carried himself with quiet confidence. His dark skin had grown a shade lighter over the years from spending countless hours at high altitudes, but his warm brown eyes still held the same enthusiasm they had when he first started flying. As he walked through the airport terminal, pulling his pilot's case behind him, several ground staff members greeted him with genuine smiles. "Morning, Captain Wilson," they called out. James was known for remembering everyone's names and always taking time to ask about their families. Today was no different as he stopped to ask Maria at the coffee cart about her son's college applications. "He got into Georgia Tech, Captain," Maria beamed. "Just like you said he would." James smiled, remembering the long conversation he'd had with her boy about aeronautical engineering. "That's wonderful news, Maria. Tell him to stop by sometime. I'd love to show him the flight deck." Checking his watch, James noted he was, as usual, 45 minutes early for his pre-flight briefing. This had been his habit throughout his 15-year career as a commercial pilot. The extra time allowed him to thoroughly review weather patterns, flight plans, and any maintenance reports before meeting his crew. In the pilot's briefing room, James settled into his usual spot, spreading out his flight documents with practiced precision. His reading glasses perched on his nose as he studied the weather radar images. The flight to Chicago would be straightforward, clear skies most of the way, with some light turbulence expected over Tennessee. James's mind wandered to how far he'd come. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, he'd been the only black kid in his school who dreamed of becoming a pilot. His father, a mechanic, had scraped together enough money to take him to air shows, feeding young James's passion for aviation. Through scholarships, military service, and sheer determination, he worked his way up from flying small cargo planes to becoming one of the most respected captains at the airline. His perfect safety record and calm leadership style had earned him numerous commendations. Just last month, he'd successfully handled an emergency landing when an engine warning light came on, keeping all passengers safe and calm throughout the incident. The airline had featured him in their safety training videos, and younger pilots often sought his mentorship. As other crew members began filtering into the briefing room, James received several warm greetings. The flight attendants respected him because he always treated them as essential team members, not just cabin staff. Sarah, the lead flight attendant for today's flight, handed him a fresh cup of coffee, black with 1 sugar, just as he liked it. "Ready for another smooth flight to Chicago, Captain?" she asked, knowing his reputation for steady hands at the controls. "Always ready, Sarah," James replied with a gentle smile. "How's the passenger count looking today?" "Full flight, sir. 168 passengers, including 3 unaccompanied minors." James made a mental note to have the flight attendants seat the unaccompanied minors where he could keep an eye on them through the cabin cameras. It wasn't required by protocol, but it was one of the many extra steps he took to ensure everyone's comfort and safety. Looking at his watch again, James noticed it was almost time to meet his first officer for today's flight. He hadn't worked with this particular co-pilot before, but that wasn't unusual given the airline's size. He looked forward to establishing the professional rapport he maintained with all his crew members. As he gathered his papers and prepared for the meeting, James felt the familiar surge of joy that came with every flight day. Even after thousands of hours in the cockpit, he still loved his job as much as he had on his very first day. The sky was his office, and he was about to go to work. Little did Captain James Wilson know that this routine morning was about to become anything but ordinary, and his years of experience would be tested in ways he never expected. The briefing room door opened, and First Officer Michael Reed walked in. At first glance, he appeared to be in his mid-30s, with perfectly pressed uniform and neatly combed blonde hair. His posture was stiff, and his blue eyes darted around the room before landing on Captain Wilson. James stood up, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Good morning, First Officer Reed. I'm Captain Wilson, looking forward to flying with you today." Reed's eyes fixed on James's outstretched hand, but he didn't take it. Instead, he moved past James to the coffee machine, his shoulders noticeably tense. The room's atmosphere shifted immediately, like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. "Let's just get through the briefing," Reed muttered, his back still turned to James. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, exchanged a concerned glance with her colleagues. James maintained his professional composure, though his heart rate quickened slightly. In 15 years of flying, he'd encountered all types of personalities, but something about Reed's behavior felt different, more hostile than mere nervousness or social awkwardness. "Very well," James said, opening his flight plan. "Weather looks good today, with some light turbulence expected over Tennessee. We should have a smooth approach into Chicago O'Hare." Reed finally turned around, coffee cup in hand. His face wore a skeptical expression that bordered on contempt. "And you're sure about that weather assessment, Captain?" The way he said Captain made it sound like an insult. "Yes, I've reviewed the reports thoroughly," James replied evenly. "Would you like to examine them yourself?" "I think I better had," Reed said, snatching the weather reports from the table. "Can't be too careful these days. They're letting all sorts just fly planes now." The room fell silent. Sarah's face flushed with anger, but James gave her a subtle shake of his head, warning her to stay calm. As they moved through the safety checklist, Reed questioned every statement James made, his tone growing increasingly confrontational. When James mentioned his recent emergency landing, Reed scoffed audibly. "I heard about that landing," Reed said. "Seems to me you overreacted to a simple warning light. Any experienced pilot would have handled it differently." James took a deep breath before responding. "The safety of our passengers is always my first priority, First Officer Reed. Sometimes that means taking precautionary measures that might seem excessive to others." "Right," Reed sneered. "I'm sure that's what it was. Precautionary measures." The tension in the room had become unbearable. Other crew members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some taking notes on their phones, documenting Reed's behavior. When they reached the point of discussing takeoff procedures, Reed suddenly pushed his chair back, standing up. "I can't do this," he announced loudly. "I won't fly with him. It's a safety issue." "What safety issue would that be, exactly?" James asked calmly, though his hands had balled into fists under the table. "Your qualifications," Reed spat out. "I need to see proof of your flight hours, your training certificates, everything. For all I know, you could have been hired just to fill some quota." The room erupted in gasps. Sarah stood up, her face red with fury. "Captain Wilson is one of our most decorated pilots. How dare you suggest—" "It's all right, Sarah," James interrupted, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. He turned to Reed. "My credentials are all on file with the airline. You're welcome to verify them with management. However, given your current state of mind, I don't believe you're fit to fly today, regardless of who your captain might be." Reed's face turned an ugly shade of purple. "You're grounding me? You can't do that. I'm reporting this to the union." "I'm not grounding you," James replied. "I'm requesting a formal review of your behavior during this briefing. Until then, I cannot in good conscience fly with a first officer who has demonstrated such clear prejudice and lack of professional judgment." Reed stormed out of the briefing room, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. James stood still for a moment, his face a mask of professionalism, though those who knew him well could see the hurt in his eyes. Sarah reached for the phone. "I'm calling operations right now, Captain. This needs to be reported immediately." James nodded, knowing that what had started as a routine morning had just become a watershed moment in his career, and perhaps in the airline industry itself. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a scene from a movie. The briefing room had transformed into a hub of activity, with airline officials rushing in and out. James sat calmly at the table, providing his statement to Linda Matthews, the chief of flight operations, while crew members lined up to give their accounts of Reed's behavior. "And he refused to shake your hand from the start?" Linda asked, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. "That's correct," James replied. His voice remained steady, but the slight tremor in his hands as he held his coffee cup betrayed his inner turmoil. It was clear from his body language and tone that he had issues with me before I'd even spoken. Outside the briefing room, passengers were beginning to gather at the gate. Through the glass walls, James could see the growing crowd, many checking their watches and phones. The flight was already 20 minutes delayed, and the situation was far from resolved. Meanwhile, Reed had barricaded himself in the pilot's lounge, making loud phone calls to the pilots' union and anyone else who would listen. His voice carried down the hallway as he tried to justify his actions. "It's not about race," Reed's voice boomed. "I have serious concerns about his competency. This is about passenger safety." Sarah, who had been standing guard outside the briefing room, rolled her eyes. She'd already shown Linda several videos she'd recorded on her phone during the briefing, capturing Reed's thinly veiled racist remarks. 2 more airline executives arrived, their faces grave. James recognized Thomas Chen, the airline's head of human resources, and Patricia Rodriguez, the chief diversity officer. They'd clearly been pulled from other meetings, still carrying their morning coffee cups. "Captain Wilson," Thomas began, "we want to assure you that this kind of behavior has no place in our airline. We're taking immediate action." Patricia nodded in agreement. "We've reviewed the initial reports and witness statements. This is a clear violation of our anti-discrimination policies." Just then, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Reed had emerged from the pilot's lounge and was marching toward the briefing room, his face red with anger. 2 airport security officers followed close behind. "You can't do this," Reed shouted, pointing at James through the glass. "I have rights. I've been flying for 12 years. Linda stepped into the hallway, her small frame somehow filling the space with authority. "Mr. Reed, you've been temporarily suspended pending a full investigation. Please leave the premises immediately, or security will escort you out." "This is reverse discrimination." Reed's voice cracked with desperation. "He's playing the race card. I'm the victim here." Several passengers had pulled out their phones, recording the scene. James remained seated, maintaining his dignity as Reed continued his tirade. He thought about all the young black pilots he'd mentored over the years, knowing this moment would either discourage or inspire them. Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through Reed's shouts. "The only victim here is aviation professionalism. We all witnessed your behavior, and there's video evidence. You should leave before you embarrass yourself further." Security finally managed to guide Reed toward the exit, his protests fading down the corridor. The passengers who had been watching began to applaud, many of them shaking their heads in disbelief at what they'd witnessed. Linda turned back to James, her expression softening. "Captain, we have a replacement first officer on the way. Dave Martinez will be here in 15 minutes. Would you like to take some time, or are you comfortable proceeding with the flight?" James stood up, straightening his uniform. "These passengers have been delayed long enough. Once First Officer Martinez arrives and we complete our briefing, I'm ready to fly." Patricia touched his arm gently. "Are you sure? What you just experienced is unfortunately not new to me," James completed her sentence. "But I've never let it stop me from doing my job, and I won't start today. Those passengers trust us to get them to Chicago safely, and that's exactly what we're going to do." The room fell silent, filled with respect for his professionalism in the face of such blatant discrimination. Outside, the morning sun had fully risen, casting long shadows through the terminal windows. In less than an hour, a routine flight had become a stark reminder that even in 2025, prejudice still lurked in the most unexpected places. As they waited for the new first officer, James pulled out his flight plans again, reviewing them with the same careful attention he always did. He had a job to do, and he would do it with the excellence that had defined his entire career, regardless of what anyone thought about the color of his skin. As First Officer Dave Martinez hurried through the terminal, the story of what had transpired was already spreading across social media like wildfire. Passengers waiting at nearby gates shared videos of Reed's outburst, and within minutes, the footage had gone viral. Dave arrived at the briefing room slightly out of breath, his dark hair slightly disheveled from rushing. He dropped everything at home when he got the emergency call, knowing the gravity of the situation. "Captain Wilson," he said, extending his hand with genuine respect, "I'm honored to fly with you today. I've heard great things about your work with the pilot mentorship program." James shook Dave's hand firmly, relief washing over his face at this simple gesture of professional courtesy. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, First Officer Martinez. Let's get through this briefing quickly. Our passengers have waited long enough." While they reviewed the flight plans, the airline's public relations team was working overtime. #Racist Copilot and #Captain Wilson were already trending on Twitter, with the video of Reed's meltdown reaching millions of views. In the terminal, passengers scheduled for the flight to Chicago watched the situation unfold on their phones. Many approached the gate counter, not to complain about the delay, but to express their support for Captain Wilson. "I feel safer knowing someone like him is our pilot," one elderly passenger told Sarah. "Someone who stays professional even when faced with such ignorance." The briefing with Martinez went smoothly, and soon they were ready to board. As James walked through the terminal toward the gate, passengers began to applaud spontaneously. Some stood up from their seats, showing their respect with a standing ovation. James acknowledged their support with a humble nod, maintaining his professional demeanor. Inside, though, he felt a complex mix of emotions: gratitude for the support, sadness that such incidents still occurred, and determination to turn this negative situation into something positive. At the gate, a young black boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, tugged at his mother's sleeve while pointing at James. "Mom, look, he's a pilot, just like I want to be." James paused briefly, kneeling down to the boy's level. "What's your name, young man?" "Marcus," the boy replied shyly. "Well, Marcus," James said, pulling out his pilot's wings pin and attaching it to the boy's shirt. "Never let anyone tell you what you can't do. The sky's the limit." The moment was captured by several passengers on their phones, adding another layer to the story that was now making national news. Major networks had picked up the incident, and requests for interviews were flooding the airline's PR department. In the cockpit, as James and Dave performed their pre-flight checks, messages of support poured in from pilots around the world. The pilots' union issued a strong statement condemning Reed's behavior and reaffirming their commitment to diversity in aviation. "Systems check complete, Captain," Dave reported, his tone carrying the respect that had been so glaringly absent in Reed's behavior. Sarah entered the cockpit with the final passenger count. "Full flight, Captain, and you should know, there's not a single passenger who asked to be rebooked after what happened. They all want to fly with you." James nodded, touched by the show of support but focused on the task at hand. "Thank you, Sarah. Let's give them the smooth, safe flight they deserve." As they prepared for pushback, air traffic control's voice crackled over the radio. "Captain Wilson, you are cleared for pushback. It's an honor to have you in our skies today." Dave looked over at his captain, admiration evident in his expression. "How do you do it? Stay so composed through all this?" James adjusted his headset, his eyes fixed on the instruments before him. "By remembering that every time I sit in this seat, I'm not just flying a plane, I'm showing someone somewhere that their dreams are possible too." The engines hummed to life as they began their taxi to the runway. Behind them, 168 passengers settled in for their flight to Chicago, many still discussing the morning's events. But in the cockpit, James was already focused on what he did best: flying safely and professionally, proving through his actions rather than words that excellence knows no color. As they lifted off into the clear Georgia sky, the ground fell away below them, along with the weight of the morning's confrontation. Up here, in the peaceful realm of clouds and sunshine, James was exactly who he'd always been, simply a great pilot doing the job he loved. While Flight 2317 cruised smoothly toward Chicago, the story on the ground was reaching a fever pitch. The airline's CEO, Robert Thompson, had just called an emergency board meeting at headquarters in Atlanta. Sitting at the head of a long mahogany table, Thompson watched the viral videos for the third time, his face growing darker with each viewing. Around him, board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. "This is unacceptable," Thompson declared, removing his glasses. "Captain Wilson is one of our finest pilots. We need to make a strong statement, and we need to make it now." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, James and Dave handled their flight duties with practiced precision. The cabin was unusually quiet. Passengers seemed to sense the gravity of the morning's events. Many were still posting about the incident on social media, sharing their first-hand accounts. "Weather report shows some turbulence ahead, Captain," Dave reported, checking the radar. "Should we adjust our altitude?" James studied the weather patterns on his display. "Let's climb to 36,000 feet. It should be smoother up there." As they made their adjustment, Sarah appeared in the cockpit with an update. "Captain, you should know, the story has made national news. CNN, Fox, all the major networks are covering it. And, well, someone found Reed's social media history." James kept his eyes forward, focused on flying. What did they find? Years of problematic posts, Sarah replied quietly. This wasn't an isolated incident. He has a history of discriminatory comments about minority pilots. The revelation hung heavy in the cockpit. Dave shook his head in disgust. How did he even get hired? Back in Atlanta, Thompson was asking the same question. The airline's HR team had pulled Reed's file, discovering that several complaints had been filed against him in the past, but none had risen to the level of today's incident. We need a complete overhaul of our hiring and monitoring processes, Thompson announced to the board. And I want Captain Wilson involved in designing new anti-discrimination protocols. In the air, the flight continued smoothly despite the turbulent situation below. James handled the controls with his usual expertise, his movements calm and measured, but his mind was processing the deeper implications of what had happened. Halfway through the flight, a message came through from headquarters. The airline's PR team had prepared a statement, and they wanted James' approval before releasing it. Dave offered to take the controls while James reviewed it. The statement was strong, unequivocal in its condemnation of Reed's actions and its support for Captain Wilson. It announced Reed's immediate termination and outlined new initiatives to combat discrimination in aviation. They're waiting for your response, Captain, Sarah said softly. James handed the statement back to her. Tell them it's fine, but add one thing. I want to be part of the solution. I'll help train new pilots and work on their diversity programs. As they began their descent into Chicago, messages of support continued to pour in. The Airline Pilots Association had issued a statement standing firmly behind James. Pilots from other airlines were posting their own stories of discrimination, turning the incident into a catalyst for industry-wide change. Beginning our approach to O'Hare, Dave announced, winds are favorable. James nodded, guiding the aircraft down with the same steady hands that had earned him his reputation for excellence. Below them, Chicago's skyline emerged through scattered clouds, a reminder that every storm eventually gives way to clearer skies. In the passenger cabin, people had their phones ready to record their landing, not out of fear, but to document what many saw as a historic flight. A moment when professionalism and dignity had triumphed over prejudice. As the wheels touched down smoothly on O'Hare's runway, applause erupted throughout the cabin. It wasn't just for the landing. It was for everything the flight represented. Welcome to Chicago, James announced over the intercom, his voice carrying the same professional tone it always had. Thank you for flying with us today. What he didn't say, what he didn't need to say, was that this flight had become more than just a trip from Atlanta to Chicago. It had become a testament to resilience, professionalism, and the ongoing journey toward equality in the skies. As they taxied to the gate, Dave turned to his captain. Sir, I know this isn't what you planned for today, but you've shown everyone what real leadership looks like. James simply nodded, already focusing on his post-flight checklist. He had learned long ago that the best response to prejudice was excellence, and he would continue to lead by example, one flight at a time. The media storm that followed the incident grew larger by the hour. As James completed his post-flight checks in Chicago, major news networks had already set up their crews outside both O'Hare and Atlanta airports. Inside the terminal, passengers from Flight 2317 were being interviewed, each sharing their perspective on what they'd witnessed. The young boy Marcus, still wearing Captain Wilson's wings pin, appeared on several local news channels with his mother. He showed me that I can be anything I want to be, Marcus told reporters, his eyes shining with admiration. Even when people are mean, you just keep doing your best. But the story was about to take another turn. By late afternoon, other pilots began coming forward with their own experiences. Captain Maria Rodriguez, a veteran pilot with 20 years of experience, was the first to speak up. I flew with Michael Reed last year, she revealed in a televised interview. He made several discriminatory comments about my accent and questioned my abilities because I'm a woman. I reported it, but nothing was done. More stories emerged. Text messages between Reed and other pilots surfaced, revealing a pattern of racist and sexist behavior that had gone unchecked for years. The airline industry's culture of silence was beginning to crack. In the pilot's lounge at O'Hare, James watched these revelations unfold on the breakroom television. Dave Martinez sat beside him, both men still in their uniforms as they waited for their return flight to Atlanta. It's like opening a floodgate, Dave observed, shaking his head. How many others stayed quiet all these years? James leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes it takes one incident to bring everything to light. The question is, what happens next? The answer began to take shape within hours. The Airline Pilots Association called an emergency meeting. Representatives from major carriers across the country joined virtually, their faces filling screens in a conference room in Washington, D.C. This isn't just about one co-pilot or one airline, the association's president declared. This is about systemic issues that have been ignored for too long. Back in Chicago, James's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in from pilots he trained over the years, each sharing how his mentorship had helped them navigate similar challenges. One message, in particular, caught his attention. It was from Robert Chen, a young pilot he'd mentored 5 years ago. "Captain Wilson, I almost quit flying because of someone like Reed. You told me to stay strong. That change would come. You were right. Thank you for showing us how to handle hatred with dignity." Sarah appeared in the lounge doorway, her expression urgent. "Captain, CNN wants to interview you live. They're setting up in the conference room." James shook his head. "Tell them I appreciate the offer, but I'm focusing on my return flight. This isn't about me. It's about making sure what happened today never happens again." As the afternoon wore on, aviation forums and professional networks lit up with discussions about diversity and inclusion in the industry. Pilots from minority backgrounds shared their stories, creating a powerful narrative of resilience and determination. The airline's CEO had been in constant meetings since the morning incident. By late afternoon, he announced a comprehensive review of all discrimination complaints filed in the past 5 years. Additionally, he revealed plans for mandatory sensitivity training and the creation of a diversity task force, with Captain Wilson invited to lead it. In the pilot's lounge, James finally checked his personal email. Among the hundreds of messages was one from his old flight instructor, now retired. "James, it read, when I taught you to fly 20 years ago, I knew you'd make a difference in this industry. But today, you've done more than that. You've shown everyone what real courage looks like, not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet dignity and unwavering professionalism." As the time for the return flight approached, James stood up, straightening his uniform. The events of the day had exposed deep wounds in the aviation community, but they had also revealed an overwhelming current of support for change. Dave gathered his things, ready to serve as first officer for the return flight. "You know, Captain," he said, "history will remember this day." James adjusted his captain's hat, his expression resolute. "Let's hope they remember it as the day things started to change, not just the day something went wrong." Together, they walked toward their gate, where another full flight of passengers waited to fly with the captain who had turned a moment of discrimination into a movement for change. 1 week after the incident, the airline industry was experiencing changes that no one had anticipated. The conference room at airline headquarters was packed with executives, HR representatives, and pilot union leaders. At the center of it all sat James Wilson, now seen as a catalyst for transformation. "The investigation is complete," announced Linda Matthews, sliding folders across the table. "Michael Reed's termination is permanent, and we've uncovered a disturbing pattern of similar incidents across multiple airlines." The findings were staggering. Reed's behavior had been reported at 3 different airlines over 8 years, but he had managed to move between companies before serious action could be taken. Each time, his victims had either been silenced or pushed out of their positions. "This stops now," declared CEO Thompson, standing at the head of the table. "Captain Wilson, we'd like you to head our new Aviation Equality Initiative. Full authority, complete resources." James looked around the room, noting the earnest faces watching him. "I'll do it on one condition. We focus on prevention, not just punishment. We need to change the culture, not just remove bad actors." The room erupted in discussion as James outlined his vision. Mandatory cultural awareness training for all staff, anonymous reporting systems, and mentorship programs for minority pilots. But most importantly, a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Meanwhile, the aviation community had rallied around the cause. Pilots from across the globe shared their experiences on a new online platform called Clear Skies for All. The stories ranged from subtle discrimination to outright harassment, creating a powerful testimony to the need for change. Sarah, who had been promoted to chief flight attendant trainer, helped organize crew meetings where staff could openly discuss their experiences. The silence was part of the problem, she explained during one session. We can't fix what we won't acknowledge. In Chicago, young Marcus had started a club at his school called Future Pilots of America. His mother sent James a photo of the diverse group of children, all wearing plastic pilot wings, their faces beaming with possibility. The industry response was swift and comprehensive. Airlines began reviewing their hiring practices and complaint procedures. Training programs were revamped to include extensive sections on diversity and inclusion. The Airline Pilots Association established a special committee dedicated to protecting minority pilots' rights. Back in his office, James reviewed applications for the mentorship program he'd designed. The response had been overwhelming. Hundreds of aspiring pilots from diverse backgrounds, each hoping to find guidance in an industry that was finally opening its doors wider. Look at this one, Dave said, pointing to an application. He volunteered to help James screen candidates. She's a former Air Force pilot, top of her class, but got passed over for commercial jobs 3 times. Get her in here for an interview, James replied without hesitation. This is exactly why we're doing this. The media continued to follow the story, but the narrative had shifted. Instead of focusing on the incident, they were now covering the positive changes it had sparked. Major networks ran special reports on minority pilots who had broken barriers, featuring James's story as a turning point. One evening, as James prepared to leave the office, he received an unexpected visit. It was the airline's most senior pilot, Captain Richard Green, a 40-year veteran nearing retirement. I've been flying longer than you've been alive, Wilson, Green said, settling into a chair. And I've seen a lot of changes. But what you've started here, this is different. This is lasting change. James looked at the photos on his wall. His first solo flight, his military service, his commercial pilot certification. Each milestone had been a step toward this moment, though he hadn't known it at the time. The real test, James replied, will be what happens after the media attention fades. Will we maintain this momentum? Green smiled. With you at the helm, I bet my wings on it. As the sun set over the airport, casting long shadows across the runway, James could see planes taking off and landing, each one carrying crews that would work in an industry forever changed by one morning's events. His phone buzzed with a message from the CEO. Board approved all your proposals. Full funding. This is your mission now, Captain. James stood at his office window, watching the planes against the orange sky. The incident with Reed had been painful, but it had cracked open a door that had been sealed for too long. Now, it was his job to make sure it stayed open for all those who would follow. Clear skies ahead, he whispered to himself, knowing that the real work was just beginning. 1 year after the incident that changed the aviation industry, Captain James Wilson stood at a podium in front of a packed auditorium. Behind him, a banner read, First Annual Aviation Equality Summit, and before him sat hundreds of faces representing the changing landscape of commercial aviation. When I started flying, James began, his voice carrying across the silent room, I was told to keep my head down and just do my job. Today, I'm telling you to hold your heads high and help us build a better industry for everyone. In the front row sat Marcus, now 9 years old, wearing a properly fitted pilot's uniform that James had specially ordered for him. Next to him were 20 other children from his Future Pilots of America club, their eyes fixed on the man who had inspired them. The changes over the past year had been remarkable. The Aviation Equality Initiative had transformed from a single airlines program into an industry-wide movement. 47 airlines had adopted James's training protocols, and reported incidents of discrimination had dropped by 60%. But numbers don't tell the whole story, James continued. The real change is in the stories I hear every day. The young pilot who finally felt confident enough to wear her hijab in the cockpit. The Native American captain who no longer has to endure racist jokes during briefings. The gay first officer who can put his husband's photo on his desk without fear. Sarah, now director of crew relations, stood at the side of the stage, nodding in agreement. Her department had become a model for other airlines, showing how to create an inclusive environment for all crew members. Dave Martinez, recently promoted to captain himself, sat among the audience. He had helped implement many of the new programs, proving that allies were just as important as advocates in creating lasting change. Michael Reed's actions that day weren't the disease, James explained, his voice growing stronger. They were a symptom of a culture that had allowed discrimination to hide in plain sight. Today, we're not just treating symptoms, we're curing the disease. The statistics supported his words. In the past year, minority recruitment in aviation programs had increased by 40%. The industry had hired more female and minority pilots than in any previous year. The anonymous reporting system James had designed had been adopted by aviation authorities worldwide. But the most significant change was in the everyday experiences of airline staff. The break rooms were more inclusive, the cockpits more diverse, and the skies more welcoming to everyone who dreamed of flying. Last week, James shared, I flew with a crew that included a black captain, me, a Hispanic first officer, a Muslim flight attendant, and a gay purser. Nobody commented on it because it wasn't remarkable anymore. That's what progress looks like. In the audience, several people wiped away tears. They had all been part of this journey, whether as supporters or beneficiaries of the changes that had swept through the industry. As James concluded his speech, he called Marcus to the stage. Together, they unveiled a new scholarship program named after Marcus's club, the Future Pilots of America Diversity Scholarship, funded by airlines across the country. This scholarship, James announced, will ensure that no dream of flying is grounded by financial barriers or discrimination. The sky belongs to all of us. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes. As James looked out over the crowd, he saw Robert Chen, the young pilot he'd mentored, now teaching at a flight school. He saw Maria Rodriguez, recently appointed as a chief pilot. He saw hundreds of faces that represented the future he had always believed in. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared stories, Marcus tugged at James's sleeve. Captain Wilson, he said, his voice serious, when I grow up, I want to do what you did. James knelt down to the boy's level, just as he had done that fateful day at the gate. You want to be a pilot? Marcus shook his head. No, I mean yes, more than that. I want to help people believe in themselves like you do. James smiled, adjusting the boy's pilot cap. Then you already know the most important lesson of all, that our greatest achievement isn't how high we fly, but how many others we lift up with us. As the evening drew to a close, James stood by the window, watching planes take off into the sunset. Each one carried not just passengers and crew, but also the promise of a future where the only qualification that mattered was the ability to do the job well. The incident with Reed had been a dark moment, but it had led to a brighter dawn. In the end, it hadn't just changed the airline industry. It had shown that when one person stands firm in the face of discrimination, they can lift an entire industry to new heights.